When I was 16 years old, I was an avid snowboarder. Me, Nick, and Wolf would go up to Nick's family's cabin. Unexpectedly, Nick's father passed away. So we make the trip up to New Hampshire. So that night, as I'm laying in bed, I'm thinking about how dark and quiet it is. I hear footsteps on the wraparound porch. And then the door opens, and this shadow figure walks into the room. But its hips are so high, I instantly was frozen with terror, and begins to walk down right next to me. And it does another quick movement, but it's facing away from me now. And it bows onto and then down through Nick's bed and disappears. Finally, I hear Nick's mom out in the living room making coffee. And the only thing I could think to do was to just ask, did either of your two sons, Nick's older two brothers, did they stop by? She's like, no. And she just goes, I heard my husband here last night too. We get back from snowboarding, and I'm laying in bed, and I'm constantly looking over at the digital clock when I heard those footsteps on the wraparound porch again. I cannot move. I'm drenched in sweat just from the few seconds that it's taken this thing to go from the door to the front of my bedroom. The door opens, it walks into the room, goes right past the foot of my bed, and I'm, again, petrified. Walks down the aisle between me and Nick. So it turns away from me and does the same thing it did the night before, folds onto Nick and disappears into the ground. When I heard Nick's mom out in the other room, it was like such a relief. And so I hear her and I go right out to the living room and I tell her everything. At the end of it, or towards the end, she just kind of stops me. She's like, John, I told you yesterday, and again, I heard it last night. That's just my husband. I heard him last night too. You got nothing to worry about. And I was like, no. I felt so helpless. That night I'm laying there, and after all my attempts to keep Nick and Wolf awake, they fall asleep. I hear those footsteps on the wraparound porch. The door opens and I hear the sleigh bells. Everything was the same. It walked into the house, but instead of going down the hallway towards our room, it kept walking into the lofted area. Walks up the stairs, and that's where Nick's mom slept. She was upstairs. I was now coming up on 3 days without sleep, so at some point that night, I did fall asleep, probably just out of sheer exhaustion. Now probably like 5 in the morning, I wake up again and I can hear Nick's mom. It didn't sound like she was making coffee. It sounded like something was wrong. And she's standing over this coffee table at the foot of the stairs and she's crying. Come here. She points to the coffee table and she's down on her knees looking at the table. And now I can tell she's probably crying tears of joy, because scratched into the coffee table were the words, I love you. I was like, I'm done.
Because, I mean, if Harry Houdini can't perform this stunt, then certainly no one else can either. But in 1990, a daring 32-year-old man named Joe Burris decided he would be the person who would finally conquer this infamous stunt. And so with all these TV cameras rolling, the assistants walk up to Joe and they begin shackling his wrists and they put these chains around his body, and then they lifted him up and put him inside of the see-through plastic coffin. And then this coffin was lowered into the 7-foot pre-dug hole that was right nearby. Once Joe gave the signal that he was ready to go, they would fill this hole in, and the stunt that he would perform would be to escape being buried alive. As they're watching this hole and as they're filming this hole, all of the cement in the hole suddenly drops about a foot.
The bodyguard who stood directly behind him was 22-year-old Melvit Altuntaş. He was a Turkish native who for 2.5 years had served on an elite riot police unit. Andre looked down at the podium at his notes, and then he looked up at the room that was filled with journalists and dignitaries, and he composed himself, he cleared his voice, and he began to speak. Behind him, Mevlut, the bodyguard, opened his jacket slightly and continued staring at the back of Andre's head. And then in one swift motion, he drew a pistol and fired 3 shots into the ambassador's back. And then when the ambassador fell to the ground, Mevlut moved on top of him and fired 4 more shots, killing him. Guests started screaming and running for cover. Meanwhile, Mevlut pointed his finger into the sky and yelled, "Do not forget Aleppo, do not forget Syria." And then he began walking around the exhibit, smashing the pictures on the wall before Turkish security forces showed up. There was a gunfight and Mevlut was killed. But regardless of why it happened, what the world remembers from this event is the award-winning photograph that was taken of Mevlut immediately after he committed the attack.
10 days later, Dylan's body was found in an area nobody was searching. In fact, he was found by accident. He was located outside of town, high up a hill in a dense forest, which in order to get there, he would have had to walk the opposite direction of the gas station. But the case gets even stranger because on the day Dylan went missing, there was a lot of snow on the ground, which meant people would have made tracks. But where Dylan was found, there were no tracks anywhere near him. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. It was as if someone had dropped him out of the sky. Another strange element of this case is Dylan was found without pants and without boots on. This led investigators to believe Dylan must have somehow made his way to that spot on the hillside in that forest without leaving any tracks, and then once he was there, he removed his pants and his boots. Except dozens of police officers and sniffer dogs were never able to find those pants and boots, despite the fact they should, in theory, be in that immediate area where he took them off. As a result, we may never know the truth about what happened to Dylan. After hours of drinking and joking around, they were standing in the backyard on the patio when they noticed a small slug crawling across the ground. And at some point, one of the boys yelled out, "Hey, someone should eat that." Sam took it as a challenge and said, "You know what? I'll eat the slug." And so he picked that slug up, threw it in his mouth, and he ate it. The next morning when Sam got up, he noticed a dull ache in his legs. So they went to the doctor, and Sam brought up the fact that he had eaten this slug, and it looks like Sam had something called rat lungworm disease. This is an infection most commonly found in rats that's caused by a parasitic worm that can be passed down to snails and slugs if they eat the rat feces that contains the parasite's larva. Based on Sam's symptoms, the doctor informed him that most likely the slug he consumed at that party was a carrier of the parasite. Just a few days after his diagnosis, Sam did develop the rare form of meningitis, and he slipped into a coma for 420 days. When he finally woke up, he was paralyzed, he wasn't able to speak, and he couldn't eat without a feeding tube. He required care 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These particular officers that would be doing this push-off had been undercover for some time in the area, and so they had a local drug house they used for these types of operations. 2 potential customers came up to the fake drug house. They knocked on the door, and the undercover police officers opened up. They invited them inside, and then once these customers were inside sitting down, they asked the undercover cops if they could buy some drugs. And as soon as the cops heard this, they whipped out their badges, they drew their guns, and they ordered them on the ground. But these potential customers, they didn't get on the ground. Instead, they whipped out their badges and drew their guns, and they said, "No, you get on the ground." Because it would turn out these customers were actually undercover police officers too, but they were from a different precinct, and so neither groups had any idea about the other. They all just eventually lowered their guns and then proceeded to beat the living crap out of each other. After the dust finally settled and all the haymakers had stopped, the 2 groups of police realized their mistake and apologized to each other. Next day, Luana was found dead in her apartment. When the authorities arrived at her house and began looking at the scene, it did not look like she had died as a result of those injuries. It looked more like some sort of ritual suicide. She was laying on this sofa with her arms over her chest. Next to the sofa was an altar that was adorned with strange occult symbols and ritual herbs and effigies. And on the altar was this goblet with deep, dark red stains on the inside. When they looked at Luana, even though she was fully dressed, underneath her sleeves were all these cuts on her arms, and there were cuts on her legs as well. After her autopsy, the medical examiner said she had died from a combination of blood loss and internal shock from ingesting massive quantities of blood that triggered cardiac arrest. Luana had been draining her own blood into the sacramental goblet, drinking it, and then doing it over and over again until she died. So the theory goes, Earhart and Noonan are making their way to Howland Island. They get off track somehow, and they wind up crash landing 350 miles away on Niku Maroro Island on one of the reefs. Noonan probably dies on impact, and Earhart, who's badly wounded and probably bleeding, she gets onto the island and she makes her way up to that area where that campfire was found. And for some amount of time, Earhart is able to survive off of whatever she had on her in those glass bottles, but in her weakened state and bleeding, at some point she probably attracted the coconut crabs who one night came out and swarmed her, ripped her to pieces, and ate her. In the 1930s, notorious dictator Joseph Stalin began deporting people that he viewed as threats to the regime. The worst fate of anybody deported to Siberia has to be the roughly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island off the western side of Siberia. As the survivors disembark onto this snowy island, they see immediately that there's nothing on it. It's this tiny little island. There's no shelter. There's no food. There's no tools. There's no way to make shelter. They're just totally stranded. Their Soviet guards had promised them a ration of flour, but for the first 4 days, they refused to give it to them, and another 295 people died. And so by the time the guards actually took their boats into shore to give the flour to these people, they were starving to death, and they rushed the boats to try to steal the flour, and the guards began shooting at them, took the flour, and went back out to the water. Almost immediately, cannibalism became a thing, and there were these roving gangs of people who would just go around and murder the weak and eat them. So Skylar, she stands up and she turns. Her back is to her two friends. And as soon as she starts walking, what she would have heard is the sound of her two friends standing up as well, and then loudly saying, 1, 2, 3. And on 3, Skylar would have felt 2 knives being plunged into her back by Rachel and by Sheila. Sheila tackles her from behind. She gets her on the ground. She pins her on her back. Between Rachel and Sheila, they managed to hold Skylar's hands down, at which point Sheila and Rachel began taking turns stabbing her in the chest and in the neck. And at some point, she just kind of gives up and she says, "Why are you doing this to me? Why are you doing this to me?" And eventually, Rachel stops stabbing Skylar, but Sheila doesn't. Sheila keeps on going until, quote, her neck stopped making gurgling sounds. He normally would just eat the apples that were right outside of his house, but he had always been tantalized by the sugar apple trees that were inside of the fenced-off section of Komodo Island. This section was, of course, teeming with Komodo dragons, and so as a result, the locals basically fenced it off. But Mohammed had always wanted those sugar apples. He'd grown up here. He never got to have one. And so this day, for whatever reason, he decided, today's the day I'm going to get one. And so after looking around and feeling like the coast was clear, he hopped the fence and he ran out to the sugar apple tree. He's reaching out and extending his arm just far enough. He wants to get one more apple, and he loses his footing and he falls to the ground. And then she hears the sound of 2 Komodo dragons running through the tall grass. She can see the grass moving as these 2 massive creatures are running and grunting at full speed towards Mohammed. Mohammed, when he fell, he had cut himself, and they smelled his blood and they charged over. The authorities were able to get out there pretty quickly, and they were able to get the Komodo dragons off before they actually consumed him, but he was already dead. And what she saw was absolutely horrifying. That popping sound she heard outside of the plane was the sound of the engine underneath the left wing exploding. When that window broke open, Jennifer, who was sitting closest to it, was immediately sucked through the window. So no one is looking around, taking stock of what's going on and assessing what to do next. Everybody's in survival mode and is basically just focused on themselves. And so despite Holly yelling out and trying to wave to people, it was worthless. Jennifer was just stuck out the window and no help was coming. And it was during this time, as Holly is holding on to her waist and she's holding on to the girl, that Holly is thinking, Jennifer, she's been stuck outside the plane where there's no oxygen for almost 10 minutes. Nobody can survive that. But there's a detail in Holly's story that makes her experience even more traumatic.